Hello and good morning. Thank you for joining us today, our weekly trade and tariff briefing. I'm Liz Radley, Director of Marketing and Communications at World Trade Center, Utah. And today we have a very exciting conversation happening. So glad you're here. If you're here for the first time, this series is intended to provide you with the latest information on trade and tariffs. And you can view previous webinars on our YouTube channel and also find updates to our tariff dashboard on our website, which we will link in the chat for you. And today we're going to hear first from Ben Collender, Chief of Staff at World Trade Center, Utah. He'll give us our latest updates to the dashboard and what you should know this week. And then we'll welcome Elena Patel. She's co-director of Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center. And she and Ben will chat through some of the exciting things that are happening. We welcome questions along the way in the chat. And I'll pass it off to you, Ben.
All right, thank you, Liz. Share my screen like usual here. So for those of you who have not been with us before, this is our tariff dashboard. This is where we track all of our updates here at World Trade Center Utah. If you want to visit and follow along with me, you can go to wtcutah.com/tariffs, where you can find a link to share these webinars as well for anyone else in your network who may be interested in having this information on a weekly basis. Um, we're going to start with an important topic, and it's USMCA. So we've had a lot of discussions about thinking about the world in terms of, you've got China over here. It's going to be the highest tariff, highest risk environment. And as you work your way closer to the United States, it becomes lower risk, lower tariff, generally speaking, in terms of like how we've been providing the guidance of how to think of these tariffs. So Mexico and Canada are really important in this. And we do have the USMCA joint review scheduled for July 1st. And so that what we have shaping up here with these negotiations is, the United States has been working closely with Mexico over the last couple of months. So we've seen a lot of the announcements about what the progress is in those negotiations. This is we've assumed this for a long time, but a lot of the language that's coming out now is just further cementing this that they're negotiating in bilateral rounds with Mexico. So Canada is not at the table for this United States-Mexico-Canada agreement. And the United States is working out primarily with Mexico a lot of the things like rules of origin and tariffs. Ambassador Greer had come out this week to say you can expect to see tariffs on USMCA countries, referring to the 232 and 301 tariffs that will stack on top of any trade negotiations that take place. Um, so the big thing is, it was announced that Jeff Goatman, who is um, the deputy at USTR, will be in Mexico with the delegation, is actually there now holding negotiations. And what they're looking for in this round of negotiations right here is to benefit. They want to make sure USMCA benefits US manufacturers, farmers, ranchers, workers, and service suppliers, and businesses of all size, including small and medium-sized businesses. So um, there's a lot going on, specifically focused on Mexico relating to USMCA. Expect to see the tariffs on the 231s and 30 or 232s and 301s stack on top in these negotiations as an outcome. So it's what we're hearing on that front. And as we get closer to July, we're going to have more and more substantive updates, I imagine, specifically surrounding USMCA. Um, the next item that we're tracking is public comment on Chinese goods. So this is something we've talked about on a previous webinar because it's been open for a little bit, but the 301 tariffs, the first round, had opened up earlier this month for public comment, and it's going to be open until July 6th, right here. So this first round was announced in July 2018, list one. These are there are going to be multiple rounds of this public comment that go in the order of the lists that were released in 2018. So Just something that we're going to keep this group updated on. There were some comments this week that these tariffs are going to be related. There's going to be a trade board set up between China and the United States, and they're going to take all this public comment from companies in the United States and bring it before that trade board. So you want to get your comments in there because USTR has publicly said they're going to use these comments to go do further trade negotiations. So not only do you want to provide comment because the government has to take those comments seriously as a part of this comment process, and it gives you some legal recourse if you feel that your comments have not been taken seriously, but also because USTR is actively seeking this comment so that they can go and negotiate the appropriate line items in these trade negotiations with China. Just briefly, we won't go into much detail on this today, but Taiwan, the Federal Register was released, and the CSMS was also released on the details of the implementation of tariff-related elements of the Trade and Security Agreement between Taipei and the Cultural Representative Office, basically Taiwan. So it has the provisions that impact tariffs from that trade deal. So if you are, or from that agreement, that security agreement. So if you are doing business in Taiwan, take a look on our deals dashboard. The CSMS is right there with the technical details on that front. And finally, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. The last update that we have is that there is no update regarding the 122 tariff. So we're still tracking July 24th for those tariffs to conclude. And so we haven't seen those. We've seen a lot of rhetoric about will it increase from 10 to 15%. We've seen no formal documentation on that front. So currently, tariff levels remain at 10%. And when we hear something, we will let this community know as soon as we do. Um, and until then, we're anticipating that those payments will continue through July 24th. And we continue to monitor things like the Scotch whiskey that I have still seen no formal documentation out on, 301s and what comes from the public comment period for those on both excess capacity, intellectual property, and forced labor. We haven't seen any formal documentation come out on Iran and the 50% there. Um, and we'll continue to monitor any discussions with Canada on USMCA as those details become available. So with that, that's a lot of updates. I'm going to hand it off to Elena. Elena, so great you can join us and talk
Yeah,
through the technicals on tariffs and taxation.
I am glad to. I'm really grateful to get to be back here again. Okay, so Ben had asked me to talk in more detail about 122, kind of where we are and what comes next. So that's what I planned to talk about. I will offer up that, if anybody has questions, it's hard for me to see the chat, Ben. So I would say, like, if somebody has a question, feel free to
We
just
will
interrupt me.
monitor.
That'd be great. But questions are welcome. And the last thing is the disclaimer, which is I'm an economist. I am not a lawyer. And so I often have to play a lawyer on TV right now as a joke because I talk about tariffs a lot in Washington, D.C. And tariffs are this perfect intersection of tax and law, which means everybody kind of has to wear both hats. But everything I say on the legal side is subject to verification. I've done my best to make sure I got those parts right. And I am probably best suited to talk more about the economics than the legal if you guys have those specific questions. However, like all of you, I have paid very close attention to 122, and truthfully, every day you wake up to see if USTR has like a announcement coming out, is something changing, is something shifting, and making sure we stay on top of that. The last 100 days have been pretty exciting in tariff legal land because there's been two strike downs. One permanent because that came from SCOTUS striking down the IEEPA tariffs, but that's intimately related to the 122 because 122 was posited as like a band-aid for the struck down IEPAs in the lead up to the SCOTUS ruling. And like almost immediately, it was 122 that was put in place. The original rate that was put in place, and I'll talk more details about 122 in general in a little while, but the rate, as Ben said, is 10%. I think, again, within 12 hours of that 10% announcement, President Trump threatened that it would go up to 15% at some point. We have yet to see it go up to 15%. So there's potentially some additional authority that could be exercised, except that we hit new legal road bumps May 7th. So this month has been kind of an exciting month in 122 land. Again, why? Because nobody had heard of Section 122 before February 20th. And then immediately a lot of legal folks weighed in to say, I'm not so sure about the legality of this authority either. And this is probably going to be a protracted legal process, just like the IEPA challenges were. This one is even more confusing to wrap your head around because of the temporary nature of the 122 tariffs. However, the trade court had struck down 122 in a 2-1 decision at the beginning of May. It was, of course, immediately appealed. So there's a federal circuit stay, which means that collections are continuing. But there has been, even more little bumps in the news, which is that there was a request to the trade court by the federal government to pause its ruling. And in that case, in that request to the court, all 3 judges ruled against the dissent. And so ruled against the stay. And so there's like a lot of back and forthing right now. What's important to note is trade court says no, it's a stay right now, which means it's in additional legal processes as we figure out what the heck will be the ultimate fate of 122. And whether it is worth this hassle, like relates to what 122 is itself, which is it's a statute that is narrow and time limited by design. So the tools available under 122 are import surcharges or quotas. There's a max tariff you can put in place of 15%. So that's why I said President Trump threatened 15%. It's kind of in his back pocket, but we've not formally gone up from 10 to 15. 122 is not as good as a negotiating tool as the IEPA tariffs because it has to be the same rate on all imports. For the IEPA tariffs really could be laser targeted on whatever bilateral negotiations were going on at the time and how President Trump and the executive branch was using the tariffs as part of that process. So you don't get country by country rates under 122. It's just a blanket. It is sitting at 10%. And then importantly, in the context of these legal processes, its max duration is 150 days. Okay, and why one might be able to use 122 is if there is determined to be a fundamental payments problem, but you can't use it for industry protection. So, keeping track of tariffs is a little bit about understanding which tool applies to which threat. And there are different tools for industry protection, namely 232. That's not what this one can be. Importantly, with the economist hat on, 122 is meant to be a response to a currency crisis, not a trade deficit. And that really is the crux of the international court ruling. And I think what will come down to the ultimate legality of 122 as it continues to work through the legal system. The phrase is a balance of payment crisis. So that means the stability of our currency is under attack. And that has been a concern in the United States, not any time in the last almost 60 years. The last time this came up was in 1971 when we ended the gold standard. And President Nixon at the time used a different legal authority to impose a tariff at the moment when he paused and effectively ended the gold standard to prevent sort of a crush on the US dollar as we moved away from that peg. In response to that thing that President Nixon did, Congress wrote in this Section 122 to kind of codify that as an appropriate response to a currency crisis. We are not facing a currency crisis. To the extent we're facing anything, President Trump and the executive branch is worried about trade deficits where we're importing more than we export. But again, the word crisis here, just like I think in the IEPA case, you should think of with a big asterisk. We've had a trade deficit in the US, really every year since the late 1970s, early 1980s. And so it's certainly not, I think any economist or any finance person would tell you, linked to a currency crisis. And with that in mind, 122 has really never been invoked like it's been invoked now. That phrase gets thrown around a lot lately. That's what we said about IEPA too. It had never been used the way that it was used. And ultimately it was determined that was exceeding the constitutional authority of that particular section. And so that's the legal uncertainty right now. Legally, the trade court has said, no, this is not an appropriate use. There's a stay, and I assume it will continue to work its way through the system. What I personally think is most interesting in the case of 122 is that the administration itself in the IEPA process is on the record as saying that 122 has no obvious application to the current situation. This was why they said in one of their briefs through the circuits that they needed to use the IEPA authority because 122, as you can see, has no obvious application here. The concerns arise from trade deficits, which are notably different from balance of payments deficits. So again, as a non-lawyer, and this was brought up in the trade court sort of decision, this is going to be the thing that the government is going to struggle with, is that they're already on the record saying trade deficit does not equal a balance of payment crisis, and that is the authority that's explicitly granted under 122. So that's the back and forth thing. Going into the IEPA, they weren't using 122. They said that's not really appropriate. And then kind of on a dime, they invoked 122 to put back together the trade authority that they had lost, citing trade deficits as the reason. So that's where this legal case is maybe even more entertaining than the last one, if you're following it. So that is the basis of the trade court saying 122 doesn't fit. It was a 2-to-1 decision. Essentially, again, trade deficits are not balance of payments issues. And so that's why the decision went the way it did. What I will note here is that there was relief that was provided by the court, but only to the 3 named plaintiffs. Even though there are a lot of other businesses and states that have interest in this case, they determined that only the 3 named plaintiffs had standing. And again, the legal thing that's a little funny here is that 122 was always going to go away. It's always been a band-aid to kind of get from IEPA to more expansive Section 301 tariffs. And so, this has to go away July 24th. Whether this is ultimately determined to be an overuse of the authority and what refunds may come from that are probably going to be decided after 122 has actually expired. And so this is going to
Elena,
be an even weirder one. Yeah.
I actually have a question related to
Yeah.
that. If the thought was that 122s were always going to go away, there's a comment in the chat that even though there's a time limit, Ambassador Greer had mentioned we could do it again and again and multiple times
Yes,
than the deadline.
that's right.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that has been the threat. I think that to the extent that this is maybe seen as a legal overreach, then the stringing together of 122, to my non-legal mind is only going to continue to weaken the case that the government makes that this was an appropriate use. But I do agree that in principle, 122 can be stringed together. But importantly, they really accelerated the 301 timeline to try to get those done and in place so that they wouldn't have to string them along. And they are moving at quite a clip. I heard Ben talking about this in the background. They have already gone through the public notice and comment period. We're just waiting for the reports to be written up at this point. And so my anticipation is the 301s will be in place before they'll need to redo a 122 10% or 15% tariff. So what's going on in the background in 301 land? It's this map. Basically all of our trading partners are currently under 301 investigations for various reasons, some under multiple reasons. And so the expectation is that, if this process is used the way we think it's going to be used, that on the other side of the 301s being finalized, the Trump administration will get back a similar bilateral authority they were using under IEPA to the extent that they're using it for negotiation purposes. And it's going to mean that Ben is going to be very busy keeping his tables up to date about what rates are applying where, because remember, 301 are country specific for sort of improper trade acts. And so, some countries like China or any country that does any business with China is hitting these for multiple reasons. And so you can layer in a lot of tariffs. So in a layer cake sense, we can get right back to where we were before, but in a much more complicated way. That was the unfortunate part of IEPA going away. It was at least somewhat simpler to keep track of what was happening because it was just one rate per country. And now we're getting just this layer cake of all of these authorities and sometimes multiple uses of the same authority for products coming out of certain countries. So they're going to keep Ben busy for a long time, keeping the trade tracker up to date. So the trend is blanket tariffs are on their way out. I think that's what's most important to keep in mind. Blanket tariffs, there really aren't authorities for the executive branch to be doing these for long periods of time. And by blanket, I mean everything coming in at a certain rate. And what we're swapping to is the more usual, executive branch authority, which is both sectoral and country specific, which is what it has been, just not quite as expansive a use of 301 and 232 than we have right now. So the bets are that 301s will be done in time for the July 24th expiration. There are 9 open 232 investigations, and if you follow, anything coming out of the executive branch, it will not be just 9. There are probably many more on the horizon. And then just for fun, I thought I would tell you, because I'm in the business of learning obscure trade acts in the last 18 months that I hadn't known before. There's another route that there's speculation that could be taken, which is a 338 section authority, which has not been used since the end of, I think since the end of the Great Recession. So it's not been used ever to impose tariffs, but people who are very interested in the continuation of the current tariff regime, in addition to talking about stringing together 122, also reference Section 338 as a possible route the administration could take. Again, I think that would be legally novel. I don't know that much about 338 actually, and so I think all of us will be learning about it should they try to go down that route. And my suspicion is that if they go down that route, it will again start a legal process that will be a little tough to keep track of. What's important to keep in mind is all of these tariffs are on a statutory clock. So this is not having to do anything with the legal process and appellate timing at this point. So what I mean to say is 122 is going to time out before the legal process ever finishes. It's going to turn off July, and hopefully from the administration standpoint, the 301s will be ready to roll out by then. So I just wanted to end with some notes to you all that I'm sure you've heard before, but like what can one do right now given, continued volatility and continued legal uncertainty? So one is to make sure that you're on top of the emergency tariff refund process because that is ongoing and it's time limited. But now that everybody's been through a refund threat that came to fruition, I would really encourage you to make sure that you're keeping track of any duties you're paying under 122. It's going to face all of the same messiness as the IEEPA tariff refunds. And DOJ is already on the record now on the heels of the international court striking 122 down. But again, only ruling in favor of the 3 plaintiffs on that particular case means that DOJ expects that there will be thousands of suits filed now for people to have standing to claim refunds. So not a lawyer, I'm not going to advise you whether that's something you should do or not, but at a minimum, you should be keeping careful attention to the 122 payments you're making in case a refund becomes available. And then no matter what the tariffs, there doesn't seem to be any end in the horizon. They're going to be around for a while, and they're going to be, unfortunately for everyone, pretty complicated for a while. Again, there'll be a series of 232s, some of them probably overlapping that layer into 301s. And so certain products coming out of certain countries could, hit 5 or 6 different tariffs by the time you get to the end customs bill. And so plan for them to stick around. And again, keeping the World Trade Center here is doing a really big service to all of us by keeping track of these various moving parts. And I would imagine the updates will keep coming and we'll all just have to keep an eye on it. That's all I have.
Well, thanks, Elena. This is
Yeah.
so great because you do such a good job making this all concise, not only the 122, but bringing in everything else and crystal balling it. We always love to ask, okay, what should companies be thinking about? So you headed that off.
Yeah, good. I've done this once before. That's why
I
I knew
know,
that was
right?
going to be
Yeah.
a question.
So appreciate the presentation. We do have a question about if these slides are
Oh, for
available
sure. Yeah, I'll
for
send them to you, Ben, and you can share them with anybody who wants them.
great. Thank you. Yeah, we'll
Yeah.
get those out to the audience if you're interested. One of the questions I had is, we had an economist presenting a few webinars back, and we were having a back and forth about projecting the economy or what it looks like.
Yeah.
So we have a couple of buckets of major uncertainty right now with both the tariffs on one side and going up, down,
Yep.
getting in place and being refunded. And then we have things with some of the hot spots around the world, Iran being one of
Yep.
them, and what that's doing to energy pricing and all of these things at once. I imagine it's got to be somewhat paralyzing from an economist,
Yeah.
but there's got to be a way to see the signal through the noise. And I just wonder your perspective on what that looks like with all of this going on, because it seems like, what was the Dow north of 50? The economy is just ripping in some ways, and maybe a lot of it
Yeah.
into AI. But like, how do you view all of this in light of the economy and maybe crystal balling a little bit there for our business community?
Yeah. So I like to think of things in terms of, vague, short, medium, and long-term pressures. I think the obvious short-term pressure we face right now is geopolitical. I think we're all hoping that, the Middle East crisis will wind down so that oil can start flowing again, and that part of volatility will settle down. The trouble is that oil prices, on spot markets might rebound very quickly. That doesn't mean that like inflation measures in the United States are going to suddenly turn back down. So what I'm nervous about in the very short run is the trend in inflation, because I suspect that's going to keep ticking up, hopefully not very quickly, but keep ticking up for a little while. There have been a lot of under the hood pressures and inflation, tariffs being one of them, that have been a little bit hard to see in the price series data, in part because of how volatile tariffs are to begin with. And so it's not always clear for how long supply chains can keep absorbing those costs on the business side before they ultimately have to be passed on to the consumer. And so in the medium run, I had always expected that prices were going to tick up as the tariffs become more permanent and sticky prices get a chance to adjust. But if that's happening at the same time as this geopolitical pressure, that's going to mean that I think there's a real risk to an inflation increase right now. On the other side of that, in my crystal ball, I'll tell you I know nothing. I only can think of all of the reasons why I know nothing. We have a new Fed chair. And so we have to wait and see how the next few FOMC meetings go in light of rising inflation pressure. And I think the new chair has been clear about what he thinks should be done with interest rates. But I think the more inflation pressure turns up, the harder it's going to be to deliver rate cuts right away. So I think there's uncertainty there. And then the economy is ripping in some sense, you're right. In the long run, one hopes that tariff volatility dies down so that the business community can get settled into whatever the new tariff regime is going to be. One hopes that the Middle East crisis is resolved and oil is flowing. And then in the background, we do have very good and at least consistent estimates that productivity is going up. So that's great for the US economy. It's
Yeah.
just how quickly can businesses take advantage of increasing productivity that's, coming from AI, kind of coming from long run investments in the economy that maybe are finally coming to fruition. So the trajectory on a going forward basis should be positive, assuming these things we're talking about will settle down. And I think I'm not a markets expert, but that's my intuition for why the markets don't turn down. I think the way some of us get nervous that they will, because if you kind of look through this bumpy period,
Yeah.
everything else suggests the US economy has a tailwind behind it.
That's great. And do you think that new Fed chair has something to do with why Trump recently said he wasn't concerned about inflation? Because that came up in the chat. Why do you think Trump recently said
I think
he
President
wasn't?
Trump has a remarkable ability to project calm in a way that actually is probably on net good for everybody. I don't think he overreacts to most things. I sometimes wish he would react to more to things than he does. And so I think the new Fed chair plus some, consistency in that he keeps telling us everything in Iran is about to wind down. Like if those things can settle and his 301s fall into place, et cetera, then again, I think inflation is going to tick up for a little while. I don't think we're going to get into kind of a runaway inflation period like we had right after the end of the pandemic. I think
Right.
the Fed chair coming in, Warsh is going to have a hard time because I do think whether he explicitly promised to cut rates or not, the Fed is not set up to have a king, thank goodness, number one. And so the rest of the board does not necessarily share that opinion. And I think it will be hard for him to have credibility if he comes in with inflation pressures and everything else going on in the economy and seems like he's cutting rates as a matter of routine. And so I'll be waiting. The first meetings are going to be really important to pay attention to.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I know we're almost at time here. If there's no further questions, I see no more in the chat, so I think you've
Okay,
addressed everything
great.
that's come through. Thank you, Elena. This
Yeah, no, it was great to talk with you all. I think my email is at the end of the slide. So if anybody wants to get a hold of me, please feel free to reach out and Ben can distribute the slides to anybody who'd like to see them. It was nice to talk with you all.
All right. Thanks,
Yeah,
Elena. And
okay.
Liz, back to you.
Thanks, you guys, for taking the time. Thanks, everyone who tuned in this week. Again, if you have any questions, please email us. You can visit our website to learn more about upcoming events and, of course, have the latest tariff dashboard. And we will send these slides out to everyone who participated today. So thank you and have a great weekend.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Elena. Thanks, Liz.